Okay. Let me go ahead and take some attendance here, and we should get on the road. Week two. It's definitely not week two. Week three. Okay, here we go. Oh, yeah, that's correct. See, Alex. No, Alex. Attendance is half of an assignment's worth, folks. And just like I said, um, if you miss too many days, you just end up tanking your own grade. Back when I was but a lad, if I missed, if we missed a class, we were allowed to miss one class in a 10-week quarter. If I missed a second class, you lose a letter grade, and if you missed a third, you lost a second letter grade, and if you missed a fourth, you failed the class.
A lot of classes, you miss two and you fail class. Not fail, like miss three, you fail class.
Yeah, a lot of
Wow.
them are two or three, and you're out.
Yeah, if it's a once a week class, you get one miss.
Yeah, I'm usually not that brutal because I know students will sometimes have real reasons as to not showing up to class, right? It's not like you don't want to. And also it's early, so I understand. That's not permission, but it means I understand. And most of y'all are young enough to where your brain plastic is still trying to figure itself out. So if anything comes up, please let me know. I'd rather know than have to guess. Marcel? Wow.
Not here. You were supposed to show. I was talking about this yesterday.
It's okay. That's just what kind of happens. Ryan? No.
No,
No.
Ryan.
Wow. They're both of them are done. Where is everybody?
I don't know if I'll be here later, but I'll let you know when it's
Oh, I accidentally gave Ryan 50 points. Let's remove those points and put a sad face in the. That's like the ultimate promotion. If I like put a sad face in there, they like understand that I'm upset. Ezekiel. Oh, there you are. All right. Sorry. I'll give you 51 points. No, I'm not gonna give you 51 points.
Zeke is fine.
Liz is not here. Zeke? Okay, I'll go ahead and write that down in my notes. Liz, what are you doing? Painful. Jackson, there you are. I think we have a guest today. I don't know what time they're supposed to be here, although I think we might be. Sophia, there you are.
Oh shoot, yeah, I have something.
Is it audit guest or?
Oh, you're gonna be there?
No, it's kind of like someone who's not enrolled in the school.
Yo, are you gonna be there?
Charles?
Here.
Charlie?
I don't know too much about the program, but okay.
Audrey?
Here.
So I haven't forgotten the conversation that I heard over here, people talking about your name.
Huh?
I'm not gonna I'm not gonna say what I heard, but
Seriously, you're not. Now I'm sad.
Vigo?
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's been an entire quarter of that.
Luke?
Oh,
No, Luke.
Luke's
Oh
here.
wait, Luke. Yep, there you
Oh
are.
yeah.
Sorry, couldn't see you.
Didn't hear my name. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. How many trees did you have?
A lot of trees.
We'll talk about trees when we get into actual environment building,
Yeah.
because you guys are probably all everybody in here is using them wrong. Uh,
Oh.
Josh, there you are.
I also did a native trees.
But don't worry about it. The first assignment is in fact the first assignment for a reason. Uh, Danielle. No Daniel.
I
All right.
used geometry more.
No Daniel. Okay.
Brushes.
All right. That's everyone for now. We'll go ahead and add some folks as they pop in if necessary. So if they pop in, make sure we check them in to the best of our ability. Let me make sure that I'm logged into our stuff so we can actually go ahead and see. Let me check my email just in case someone decided to just be like, I'm gonna run late today because I'm. Oh, Liz emailed me. Wow. Yes, it will. I'll. It'll be in the appropriate week header. All right, there we go. Let me check my roster, make sure we didn't lose tons. Nope, we still have a full roster. Okay, yeah, it's just people are just over it today. Um, that's okay. Let's talk about a few things. I had a question earlier today. But before we get into the Unreal stuff, let me talk about some announcements this week. It's the 8th. In a little bit over a week, on the 18th, the IGDA San Diego chapter is having another mixer. It's their typical monthly mixer. No, students are not required to go, but it's a good opportunity to, since most of you are still relatively fresh, that you start doing the networking stuff. If you're curious about the networking stuff, there are students who typically go to the classes, to the networking stuff, just for the sake of like building up their reputation in like the local community and whatnot. Getting a gig is a lot easier when it's a battle against people that you know versus the machine that makes up Indeed, right? If you are going to be guessing about your job, we don't guess here. For as much as I like to guess and like wing it, we don't wing it when it comes to our careers. So usually I tell students if they've gotten the opportunity to go to or participate in anything related to the local games development community, please consider starting that journey. Mostly because it will only help you in the long run. Now, if you're a weirdo or if you're like pure evil, it's only going to hurt you because like the community is a local community. Everyone's fairly everyone's nice. What was your last name? Let me go ahead and put you on it. What's that?
Alex.
There you are. I wasn't know your first name. I usually start by last
Sorry.
name.
How was the traffic?
It's okay, Alex. No worries. We got you. All right.
Try not to make it happen.
No, don't worry. Don't worry. Local community is incredibly nice, very professional, but also very fun. It's probably one of the best or my favorite parts, because like work is work. You get what I'm saying? Like we like our jobs. A lot of the rock star folks and a lot of people who interface with each other, we all like our jobs, but we like each other more. I generally tell students that if you're going to be spending your career working on or getting around or working through or building your career in games industry or the games development industry, I'll get to you in a second. I strongly encourage you to make friends in the community, mostly because it can only help, right? It can only help if somebody asks, hey, do you know this person? Of course I do. Are they suck? Yes, they are. Don't hire them. And it's usually that easy. Go ahead.
So when you get hired, how do you overcome the fear of getting overworked?
Well, first of all, usually new people don't necessarily have a good solid grasp on work-life balance. It's going to be up to your lead. Like when I was a lead in visual effects, working on movies that I worked on. Yes, I have IMDb. You can go ahead and look it up if you want to see. It was my responsibility to make sure that my subordinates were not like dying, if that makes sense. I think good responsible leads and seniors take care of the juniors. I think that's something that is not very often a thing that happens everywhere, but I think in larger, more established studios, I definitely adopt juniors. Like they become my children, my in development children. Mostly because I can't do all the work. I can't do all the work at the same time. I can't, just so much stuff on my plate that typically it's not possible to finish everything. How do you get over the fear? You trust your lead to make sure that you're getting assigned what you can do, and you talk to your lead or your senior or whoever's in the group that you might be getting overwhelmed with stuff, or your backlog is getting too crazy, so on and so forth. It is entirely not really up to you whether or not you get assigned 10, 15, 20, 30 things. It's really about whether or not you are doing the work that you're assigned to do, right? I don't think about it anymore. I've been doing it long enough to where it's like, okay, if they assign it, it's not unusual, for example, you show up to work and you have like 10 things in your queue, and then you're working on one thing that is higher priority, and then 2 hours later, you see 4 things in your queue because it got shuffled away from you. That's normal, right? That's usually production, that's usually your lead, shuffling work around to make sure work is being distributed properly, right? How do you avoid being overworked? If you you can avoid overtime, if you don't need overtime, don't work at a studio that's struggling to keep itself running. Um, make sure that your make sure that your pay. Sorry, I got a little bit of dry throat here. Make sure that your pay pays well for your 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 or 9 to 7, depending, and that you're not trying to thrive off of only overtime. That's what I did early in my career. The only time I made any money was when I was working overtime, so I tried to work overtime all the time. That ain't healthy. Um, Obviously, communicate and make friends with your lead. Your lead's going to be the advocate for you when work is coming down the pipeline, because they get the last say on who gets stuff assigned depending on like a group, right? A pod, like when I was at Sony, a pod is usually anywhere from 8 to 15 people, depending on how many people need to be on a certain task. Working usually on like a small area, right? Everybody is working on the art, the design, whatever is happening in the level, so on and so forth. Usually a small segment, right? Depending on how many people are on there, your lead's going to be able to discern who gets what work, right? If you're really green, I am definitely not going to trust you with mission critical stuff. I'm going to get about 50-60% of it done. So, like for example, if I'm doing technical art, which is mostly my background, I'm going to assemble as much of it as possible. I'm going to try to like put it together. I'm just going to hodgepodge it together. It's not going to be garbage because you need to work from it, right? But you'll get something that's about maybe 40, 50, 60% done, maybe even less depending on if I'm swamped, right? But then it's your job to finish it, right? Same with programmers. You're not trusted. You're not going to be told, hey, program this entire system that the game depends on and hope for the best. It doesn't work that way. We don't trust juniors to do that kind of stuff. We trust them to finish the stuff that we've already started. If you're really, really good and you know what you're doing, yeah, absolutely. You're trusted with more responsibility. But overwork, that's kind of a complicated question. That's really up to you to decide whether or not you're overworked. And, definitely show some gumption. I am not a big believer in that the younger generation, rather you guys and gals, are soft for any reason. I think there's a lot of people, especially now, who I come from old stock, so we were always told never to complain, so I never did. But there were a lot of times when I was pretty underwater on my assignments or on my tasks, and I couldn't get out from under them, and I just let them cook until it was a problem, right? I don't encourage you guys to do that. I usually tell people, hey, if you're falling behind on something, if you're running through the time, because usually everything has budgeted time, like you've got 3 hours to finish a trash can, and I mean it's done, unwrapped, bone, skinned, walking, talking, 3 hours. That's all you got. That thing better be done by lunch. If you're in at 10, you're done by lunch, right? Which is weird because a lot of folks here take weeks to do assets. No, you get a lot faster once you get really comfortable. Talk to your lead, tell them what's going on. And I hate to say that for a lot of like juniors, like people whose like first gig it is, the percentage of people to get their second gig is usually dependent on whether or not they can get comfortable with production work. Because speed is power in production. If you're slow, if you don't get faster, if you don't get better, you probably don't get your contract renewed, and then you might hate it, and if you hate it, then why go back in, right? So, long story short, how do you manage overwork? It's a team effort, so definitely talk to your lead. And definitely, don't do a lot of work without any kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Do your job, but at the same time, like if you're feeling lost, if you're feeling like you're not getting it done, if you feel like there's some kind of problem in your production, if you feel like you don't understand what's being assigned to you, talk to your lead because they'll be able to clear that up. You're not going to be given something and then be like, oh, good luck. It doesn't work that way. Because let's say I'm your lead, and I let you do something messed up for 5 hours. I don't get those 5 hours back. You know who gets yelled at? Me. I'll get yelled at by my senior or my lead. Usually, if I'm a lead in a department like say technical art, usually the principal or the person who's in charge, if not the art director, then the CD, the creative director, or the executive producer, or someone who's higher than me is going to come and be like, hey, what's going on? Why did you assign that? They're not going to yell at you, they're going to yell at me. And then I'll yell at you. Well, we don't really yell, it doesn't work that way, but you get the idea, right? It's just production. And then if it continues to be a problem, my solution is usually to get people to move off of my team. I don't usually fire people. I have recommended people for firing, but I usually don't. Usually it's like, hey, it'd probably work better in another group because this is not working right here. So there you go. All right. So yeah, IGDA Mixer next week. I'll announce it again next week. Obviously, I'm just trying to warn people now because usually they're like, oh, I need a week in advance to kind of plan out my night. It's going to be at Ataraxia Aleworks. If you haven't gotten a chance to sign up for it, oh, I don't have Firefox on this machine. I prefer Firefox. Here, let me install it. Come on. Salud. Salud. The third one's gonna cost you. Come on.
You have to pay for some.
Oh, the first two are free. I'll skip this step for now. I'll skip this step for now. Yes.
Downloading a browser on a browser.
Okay. I'm somewhere in that picture, I forget where. Oh, there's Judah. So if you're interested in keeping up to date on that stuff, I strongly recommend. The website is igdasandiego.org. They do have their own Discord. That's usually where they make most of their announcements. I strongly recommend if you are interested in doing your networking or interfacing with the local community, by all means, join their Discord. It's just a great place. It's a great community place. It's a good place to ask questions, so on and so forth, and other groups spawn from there as well. So there are subgroups within that group. It's basically the largest games development community in the San Diego area. Yeah, there's a couple of other smaller communities. They don't really talk to us, and I say us like I'm still organizing it. I used to be an organizer, but it's the largest group. Typically, there's a couple of game jams and portfolio reviews. It's a good opportunity to kind of join the local community and start kind of like getting out of your student shell, because eventually you're going to have to. There's no way around it. And so the easiest way to kind of get through that is to start interfacing with other devs and getting your face known. If you're curious, funnily enough, the Asperian Reach team typically does go to the mixers. So if you're interested about that, interested in talking to them about how to kind of penetrate that group, talk to Jack or Kiki, or well, Sean's not here anymore, but talk to Liz, so on and so forth. They'll be able to kind of guide you in that direction. Because they'll be probably the best advocates for it. I'm just explaining it in like the professor kind of way. They actually go and interface with other devs, and of course they're recognized as being mine, so to speak, because I'm responsible for them. But I don't have bad reputation, so if you say that you're in one of my classes, you'll be treated with fear, but also respect. No, maybe not respect, but maybe fear. It'll be fun, but you get the idea. It's a great place. You got to do it. No, you don't have to go to everyone. No, you don't have to go to this one, but you got to do the interface networking stuff. It's unavoidable, right? That's just the way that the industry works. Let me see if I have anything else for you guys. Oh my gosh. I usually keep my eye out for internships for local areas. For example, Riot and Obsidian are two big ones, but Riot currently has none, and neither does Obsidian. So when I get opportunities for internships, I'll go ahead and make sure that you guys and gals know about them. I'm not going to advocate for anyone in particular, so it becomes a competition between each of y'all. So, say for example, two of you want one internship, you're gonna have to figure out how to get through to it. So, I don't unfortunately have anything related to that right now. I just checked my list. That's a shame. All right, that's all the announcement stuff that I have. Let me go ahead and get into this. There we go. All right, that'll be okay. Minimize that. Okay, I'll minimize that. So this week, we're going to talk a little bit, excuse me, about materials and lighting. I'm going to fly through about this as quickly as possible because it's a 10-week class. I can't spend multiple weeks talking about both of them. And I received quite a few questions related to both via email over the last week. But don't worry. The assignment tonight, should we get to it, is based on two things. One, if you like your first assignment enough, you can use it for this assignment. But also, I'm providing another map just in case if you're like over it, which a lot of students are typically. The second class for Game Design 2 will make it more mandatory to work on your own stuff. In the intro class, I'll provide what I can to make sure that students have a good transition in understanding the engine and understanding the process. So, without further ado, let me go ahead and start talking about the lighting engine, and let me go ahead and start talking about applying and working through materials, and we'll see where we'll end up here in about 2 hours. So, do I have any questions before we get started? I saw a couple people set up. Go ahead.
So I recorded on my phone because I didn't really remember how to export it. I tried to go back and couldn't, but I remember that conversation we had last week about late.
I won't consider it late, but you really should record it properly.
Maybe after the class, you kind of just talk me through it real quick.
I just used OBS.
Yeah, I use the NVIDIA Shadow Play because you can add filters to it. It looks amazing. We can talk about those options here. I've got it both set up on these machines. So, yeah, if you stick around, it shouldn't take me more than 5 minutes to cover it. Go ahead.
Are you record every single lecture?
I typically do, and the question came up earlier. I typically do record our sessions for multiple reasons. Mostly because, well, in a perfect world, all of these machines would be PCs, and I would periodically lecture, stop, and let you guys do the thing that I'm doing, right? So that I understand that you're actually able to physically practice the thing. Believe it or not, most of the time when I'm making something, I don't think about it, I just start spitting out commands, right? It's very normal. Because you just kind of already know what you're trying to make. But because we can't do that, because not everybody has a laptop or everything capable, etc., I do record the lectures. However, because this is an in-person class, a good chunk of the grade is still attending. So don't use the lectures that are recorded in lieu of in-person class time. You will probably fail the class if you continue to. I've had a couple students disappear after like 2 weeks. That's why the attendance is so heavily graded. I hate attendance as a concept, and I'm very lax on it. People are going to miss. Like Liz let me know that she's going to miss today, so I'll figure that out, and it'll be fine. Question?
I've taken the texturing and lighting class. Is this week's stuff going to be mostly that?
Probably review for you.
Okay, gotcha.
Maybe some new stuff related to stuff like material domains and whatnot. A lot of it is just kind of like if you've taken can I see hands for who's taken that class?
Liz
That's
has as well.
yeah, that's kind of what happens here. In a perfect world, you'd take this class before you take material and lighting. That's usually not what happens, which is why there's only maybe 2 of you.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what happens when students are taking the class a la carte. So, do you know light masks? Do you know how all that stuff works?
For the most part. Yeah. I've also done.
I imagine that's Grant.
Yeah.
Yeah, he knows it because I taught him how to use it.
I want to take more of his classes, but I don't have, like, oddly enough, I don't have, like, a lot of the Maya prereqs.
Yeah, your case is not going to be. You should be able to breeze by this week relatively easily. That's kind of how it works.
Do they use Unreal Engine for that class?
Which class?
Material and lighting?
I think Grant is using Unreal exclusively.
Yes,
So.
yeah.
Is he still doing the subway?
Yes. in fact, the subway, my unfinished subway is what I do store my environment this week.
That's totally fine.
Yeah. I've also taken the virtual production class, so I know.
With Max.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, so my knowledge on it is kind of spotty. Like I know certain things kinda well, but other than that, it's mostly new to me.
Yeah. Well, that happens. That happens here. We'll see if we can't do something a little bit more interesting to kind of expand your like your
Yeah.
understanding of lighting and whatnot. But most of this, funnily enough, the other person who teaches the lighting stuff is somebody who I taught, which is like kind of amusing in like a weird way.
Yeah.
I've scaled a lot of that back, mostly because I want him to cover that because that's his class in particular. But we didn't used to have that class, or rather, back when he was a student, it was a little bit less. It was more muted, and then it got a little bit more spread out over time. So a lot less of that is covered in these particular classes. I probably only cover it for like a week, as opposed to like 10 weeks of material and lighting. So, anyways, let me talk a little bit about the lighting system and structure in the Unreal Engine. Let me make sure that I'm looking at the right thing, because this could be relatively involved here. Okay. Let me go ahead and make this as easy as possible. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I'm going into a thing that I can use. Okay. Let's already have an environment that I can work with. House wood. Let me make sure I'm grabbing everything I need to. All right. All right. Let me go ahead and grab an asset that we can use. Do not give me that, machine. Do not complain to me. Okay, that'll be fine. Oh, not perfect. Excuse me. Let me fix that real quick. Oh. There we go. Let me establish this real quick.
That's smart. I always used to use it as one item that was thrown into like Substance Painter.
It can be. It depends on what you're trying to do. In another version of this project, I've got multiple alternate shells. Funnily enough, the house is the same, so the different shells allow you to decorate it in different ways. So you can have multiple shells. The outer shell, which is just like wood. There's some versions of it that are more dilapidated or funny or more fun or whatnot. Or if you really if you really want to, here's your.
Tatooine house.
Let's see what the here's your dome. Oops.
It's too stretched out.
There we go. Good enough. All right. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the tools, especially the lighting tools, and then we'll get into the material tools in Unreal. After that, we're going to hop into an assignment, or rather into a setup that I already have using some of the older projects that work on the machines. So basically, I'm going to be using a map from Infinity Blade Grasslands. That map itself, I have a custom map for you guys with all the gameplay stuff stripped out of it, so that we can go ahead and use the assets and use the empty lighting environment so that we can understand what's physically going on. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the lighting by default. Before anything happens, when it comes to gameplay, especially in the Unreal Engine, you have to make a decision early on with your lighting. what your lighting solution is going to be. Epic has 3. One of them is not really for games per se. Epic has Lumen, which is the default system in Unreal. What you're seeing right now, I'm going to turn my scalability up to high, and I'll talk about scalability here in a sec. One way to check to make sure if Lumen is enabled is to go to your view mode for lit and check to see if Lumen is in fact enabled. Oh, Lumen is not enabled on this project. I'm glad we checked. Let's go ahead and enable it to make sure that I've got it all set up. Do that. Forgot that I disabled it on this project for speed purposes. In fact, for those of you who are curious about setting it up, if you're using a project that has it disabled for whatever reason, like me, let's go ahead and talk about setting it up. So for example, in the project settings, you can control anything about the rendering or the engine. Typically, I'll scroll down to rendering, and then I'm going to move my way down to wherever the dynamic global illumination is supposed to be. As you can see, the dynamic global illumination method is set to none. I'm going to set this to Lumen, and then you're going to get a warning. Lumen reflections are designed to work with Lumen GI, and as such are automatically enabled. Lumen GI has mesh distance fields. This has been enabled, requires an editor restart. That's okay. So both of these will change. And I'm going to change my shadow map method to virtual shadow maps. That pretty much sets up the default. Now, I got an email about this where someone ran into this issue exactly as I've shown it right here. This happens if you're using older assets in the Unreal Editor. This is because a project may have been opened or opened in an older version of Unreal. There's a variety of different reasons why this gets disabled, but it's an automatic disable. Rather than try to force it and let the engine crash, the engine will stage itself down to allow compatibility over performance, or rather over high visibility performance, meaning like good looking lighting. So if you get this message, you can actually go ahead and fix it. I really hope I don't have to do a full rebuild. But I'm going to go ahead and find my Windows platform down here. And as you can see, Shader Model 5 becomes the default. I'm going to enable Shader Model 6. Cool. You can see. This is because the different shader models control what DirectX version is going to work on your machine. For those of you who don't know, question?
Sorry, which thing did you hit to enable Lumen again?
Oh, let me go ahead and go back to that.
Mine?
If Lumen isn't enabled on yours for whatever reason, either because you're using an older project or you're using something that that's not unusual, especially for some of you who have been in another project and so on and so forth. Down under rendering, that's going to be your global illumination and your reflection method. Both of those should be set to Lumen.
Both of those were set to Lumen, but it still won't let me turn it on.
What's your engine scalability at?
Low.
We'll talk about that in a second.
Medium, sorry, medium.
That's answering the question again. Set it to high and watch what happens. I'll talk about that in a second. The reason why I can't demonstrate that part is because I'm going to have to restart. So let me go ahead and restart my project here. Save my blank project. And hopefully I don't have to do a full rebuild.
Oh, yeah, so it's a high.
Mm-hmm. Come on, it's making me hopeful. Don't give me hope. I already know what this looks like. Come on. I already know what the final one looks like. I should know. I put it together. There we go. Now, this poor machine can't really handle Lumen, so you'll understand why here in a sec. All right. So, the default, when you launch the engine and have done nothing, will be with Lumen on. Lumen is considered real-time. It is a form of ray tracing, but not true 100% ray tracing. It's considered a solution developed by the Unreal, by the Unreal team at Epic, to make high-performing, what we refer to as GI, or global illumination, which creates a very dynamic form of lighting in an engine. Most games do not use any form of, well, that's not true. Most games do not use lumen. There's only one that I know of that is actively using lumen and the Unreal solution, and that's Immortals of Avium, and that game runs real poor. I will say that lumen is a great tool to start with if you do not know what you are doing with your lighting, because all of your lighting will look amazing. Well, will look good, not amazing. I can make my, ask Grant about it too, but I can make my bakes look better than anything that Lumen can do. But that's because of how baking works. We'll talk about that in a second. Just like we experienced, if your engine scalability is lower than high, Lumen is automatically disabled. That is because in order for Lumen to operate, it requires the engine scalability to be at high or above. That is by default, that is inherent engine behavior. So a good way to test to see if your project has Lumen set up is not to go into the settings, but to simply enable your viewport for Lumen. And if you get those 3 boxes, so on and so forth, congratulations, your project is in fact set up for Lumen and is using it as a default solution. Now, what that means is when you have Lumen enabled, a lot of the lighting is relatively simple. There's very little that you need to do to actually get the lighting working. Essentially, it's what we did in our first section. What you do is you set up your lighting according to what you need to, which means like you can hit control. Oh, sorry. There we go. There. All you have to do to get your lighting to look reasonably decent is, here, I don't need the overview anymore. Hit Control L, hold on to it, set up your lighting, and bam, everything will work out of the box. The default Unreal Sky is lumen sensitive. Question.
So when I have it set to high, I have the 2 drop downs set to lumen, but it still won't let me turn it on.
It still won't let you turn it on?
Yeah.
Take a look at it real quick.
It'll lit. I tried lit face, it doesn't do anything.
Well, you have to go to the overview.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's working.
Alright, okay.
No worries. So there it is. That's lumen lighting. But let me illustrate a couple of issues with lumen lighting that you might have to run into, or that you will essentially run into with lumen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing lumen in general. Lumen is a fantastic solution to a games development problem that exists to solve high quality lighting with low performance. In fact, let me demonstrate some of the lumen stuff. I'm going to go ahead and group all of this together. That's Control G for those of you who are curious. Let me go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and, do I have my starter content? Yes, I do. Let me go ahead and demonstrate something real quick. I'm going to go ahead and grab some architecture pieces. We'll grab 4x300. We'll do this. Top view, press F. That's forward, so I'm going to just rotate it 90 degrees. I'm going to make sure I'm in a position that I can do this. Okay, let's do this. 90 degrees. Just gonna line that up as best as I can. Line that up as best as I can. We'll do this way. Line this up best as I can. Hope that I got this lined up properly.
So all of it's just gonna create instances.
Yeah, that's all it's doing. And now I'm going to select all of these, and I'm just going to, where's my 4x300 wall? There it is.
How did you pull up that viewport?
Which viewport?
Where it has the sky above the
At the top view, it's actually asking.
Go ahead a little louder. I'm sorry, I'm not really clear on.
where you were able to edit those architecture.
Oh, the top-down view?
Yeah.
It's just your standard fare for what your viewports are supposed to be. typically, if you're trying to get high accuracy, your viewports, your orthographic, or excuse me, orthographic view modes, or view modes. What's going on with my English here? Are designed so that you can quickly place things using wireframe or orthographic view. Typically, I only use it for like high precision environments, but not everything is super high precision. Most of it is vibes based or on the snap grid anyways. But if you're trying to do something quickly, like line something up like that, you can get away with it pretty quickly by doing something like that. And as you saw, I went in and replaced all the walls with this, the windowless version, with just a handful of clicks. So it's usually relatively quick when you're working with it. The reason why I want this is because I can demonstrate some Lumen stuff here. So let's go back to perspective view. Oh, I need a roof. That's a floor. That's fine. Do I have it selected? Yes, I do. Is that good enough? Does that fit? Come on, mouse. There you go. Yeah, that's sealed. That's fine. Excuse me. All right, my poor machine is running out of VRAM, but it is what it is. That's just kind of how this thing is. All right, so a couple of things about Lumen that you have to know. In order for Lumen to run properly, Lumen generally requires that the sky and the clouds basically be infinite. So in order for that to work, a lot of the skylight structure has to have this option turned on. That's SLS real-time capture. Do you see that over there? We'll talk about what the skylight and stuff like that is here shortly. But I'm just kind of doing a quick overview of Lumen so that people can see what it physically does. Go ahead and do this here real quick. Where is my directional light? I'll grab this real quick. Set the lighting up higher so we get more lighting. Where is my... Talk about that real quick. So let me go ahead and do something here real quick so we can see kind of how Lumen works here. I'm just going to go ahead and make something here real quick so we can test this out. Someone pick a color.
Green.
Purple, green.
I heard green first. No, I don't need a scaler. Good enough.
Are you making a lamp?
Kind of. All right. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is how Lumen basically works in construction. A lot of what is physically happening with Lumen is it provides you, number one, with something called GI, global illumination. What you're seeing here is an asset that has an emissive texture, basically a texture that is emitting light, being able to be used to fill an environment with more lighting. Believe it or not, one of the best portions of Lumen is not actually physically using the lights in Unreal to create lighting, but to create assets that introduce light in the scene. I'll talk about the lighting shortly, but when it comes to using Lumen, everything is incredibly reflective, which means that assets by their sheer nature will output some amount of light if there's anything to emit, assets will naturally want to reflect their color and influence the environment. That's how lumen works. The size of the asset also controls the size of the fall off. So if we make this smaller, notice how it looks a little bit splotchier? This is one of the limitations that lumen runs into very quickly. If you don't have enough lighting power, you simply will get really splotchy results. We live with that typically. The only solution to fix this is to switch to light mass, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Lumen requires a significant amount of energy in order, and I say energy because there's some scientific principles such as inverse square law, so on and so forth, in order for the lighting to look good. When you start getting into a situation like this where you have powerful lighting but a small asset, that splotchiness is unavoidable. You can increase the power of lumen using command line, but the performance gain, or the amount of performance that you get versus the amount of stress on the machine, becomes logarithmic in the sense where it's like you are adding a ton of overhead on your machine and not a whole lot of improvement in performance, and there is a limit. At some point they'll probably improve it to that fact. Most games are going to be using baked lighting, but for students in my particular classes, if you're interested in doing one or the other, I don't mind, whatever you're most comfortable with, but more than likely if you're going to be taking Grant's class in the future, he will have you bake your lighting, because aside of one game, everyone bakes their lighting because it makes the file size smaller, it makes the performance higher, and really what we care about in games is high performance and scalability rather than fidelity, which, you know, playing a game in the last 5 years, games look real good. They're not using real-time lighting. I mean, there's RTX ray tracing, but that's Nvidia's product. You can, in fact, use it. Go away. I don't understand. It is in the marketplace. Go figure. This is another solution. If you really want to mess with Grant, use this and don't tell him, because it's going to look different, and he's going to not be able to identify it. But he also can't help you. However, I believe that the version of Unreal that has to be used is, let me look at this. Did they update it? Looks like they did in fact update the SDK here. Ah, there it is. This is currently limited to Unreal 5 unless you are getting NVIDIA certified. You don't have to worry about this. This is their, I'm not going to call it Lumen because it's not Lumen. This is like, how can I explain this? It's like someone calling ray tracing Kleenex, but you don't actually buy Kleenex boxes. You buy whatever tissue that is in Cottonelle or whatever is out there, right? Every studio is going to have their own solution, if not written from scratch, then using the defaults. RTX and Lumen are very related, but they are not the same product. So when someone says, oh, I'm going to put RTX in my project, that means nothing to me, because that tells me, oh, you're using NVIDIA's plugin? And then a lot of people will be like, oh no, I'm using Lumen. I'm like, don't call Lumen RTX, it is not technically the same thing. And it's not even being pedantic. They're two separate technologies. Go ahead.
If you're an indie dev, is it better off? Are you better off using a pre-made lighting system like this, or?
If your game is gonna be a relatively simple game and like using like normal lighting, and just bake everything, just use light mass. There's nothing wrong with baking lighting. It looks fine, it performs well. Lumen is really just, I don't know, I'm kind of annoyed with Epic that they've made Lumen the default when really nobody is using it. But that's really up to you to decide. Lumen will run on a lot of machines, but usually they'll run on anything modern. If you're making a cell phone game, if you're making a game on the Switch, if you're making a game on mobile, if you're making a game on Xbox, if you're making a game on anything that is not cutting edge hardware, you are not using Lumen. And it doesn't even have to have like super cutting edge. Anything like 2060 or higher, like in terms of graphics card quality, which means you are immediately cutting off all phones, you're immediately cutting off all tablets, no iPads, most consoles. Do you get what I'm saying? Lumen is great if your solution is going to be to create the best looking, best performing game for the current generation of high performing hardware. We don't do that. We try to aim for as many machines as possible, which means that typically you're going to be using lightmass. Anyways, let me go back into Unreal here. So it gives you an idea of kind of how it works. The other issue that you'll very quickly run into, and I need to actually create a post-process volume here. I'll talk about this volume in the future. I disabled it in this project, but I've re-enabled it just so people can see. Is the default behavior of Unreal, for those of you who've played around with it, is to have the adaptive eye turned on. Let me explain why the adaptive eye is kind of a problem, and then you can make decisions. You'll notice that I didn't have this on by default. I disabled it, but I'll show you how to re-enable it and so on and so forth. The default behavior for Unreal is to have what's called eye adaptation. Does everybody see that? So I'm staring at the light, and then I go back inside of a room. And in fact, I can visualize this to show people what's going to physically happen. So while we're in our dark room, we can control how wide and how narrow our eyes, our digital iris is. Most games do not use eye adaptation because it becomes very difficult to work with. Eye adaptation typically is required for, like, in some cases maybe cinematics, but typically in games, eye adaptation is not something that we like to use a lot of unless we go inside of a building. We're trying to simulate going inside of a building, I guess. Think of a game that uses eye adaptation, COD. They specifically make it so that you can, use some of it, but it's just mostly for visual effect, right? It's not used for gameplay, it's used just to kind of make it look better, so on and so forth. What we're seeing here is going to be the effect of lighting on our, does everybody see kind of how our iris kind of changes? What you're controlling is essentially when your eye gets smaller, everything gets darker because there's more light in the scene. When your eye gets wider, everything gets brighter. It sounds weird to explain it that way, but only because your eye is letting in more light because it's a low light situation. Eye adaptation is going to mess with your lighting. There's almost no way to get it right if your eye adaptation is on by default. The way that you can disable this at the project level is going to depend on what you want to do. Typically, I tell people that if you're going to be doing any kind of lighting in Unreal, chances are pretty good. What are you doing? Thank you. Chances are pretty good that you'll want to disable eye adaptation, but it's really up to you if you want to or not. I generally encourage people to do so. It becomes difficult to test your lighting if you're constantly waiting for your eye adaptation to kind of kick in. The way that you can disable it is you can go into settings, project settings, and I usually type in auto exposure. And this checkbox here, in fact, let me enable it in the project settings. This will be enabled by default. You can disable it at the project level. If you know that your game doesn't need auto exposure, like, does anyone think that games like Ori and the Blind Forest would be improved by auto exposure? No, of course not. It doesn't work that way, right? Think of a lot of games that would not benefit from it. You turn it off at the project level, and then you should be fine. I'm going to enable it. This is the default right here. And you'll see that the behavior is in fact working. The other way to disable it, or enable it depending on what you're trying to do, is to use this little guy over here called the post-process volume. We'll talk about volumes in the future when we're talking about gameplay volumes. Volumes in general allow you to control the behavior of something in an area. What I've done here, and you can create that by coming up to here. This is a post-process volume, and yes, it shows up that many times because it's tagged by all those things. The post-process volume is a volume that allows you to control where a behavior is going to be as far as your exposure is concerned. For our cases, I'm going to drag out the post-process volume. I'm going to scroll down to where I get to, in my version of this engine, it's min brightness, max brightness. If you've opened a newer project, it might be min EV, max EV. It's going to depend on what version of the engine that you're using. It doesn't really matter. Or EV100, EV0, so on and so forth. It's going to be slightly different labeled depending on the version of the engine. But what you can do is these are the default settings. I'm going to go ahead and set the value from min brightness to max brightness, and here I'll demonstrate. I'm going to set this to a value of 1. If we highlight this and we let it kind of tell us what it's supposed to do, disabling adaptive eye is the same as setting the min and max EV exposure value, if you want to call it that, to a value that's equal to min and max. So if you have 1 and 1, that's going to disable the adaptive eye. I generally encourage students to make that decision early on. Do you want adaptive eye in your project? That's okay. Don't disable it at the project level. Disable it using the post-process volume. And then when you're done, delete the post-process volume. Or at least that post-process volume. The problem with the post-process volume, the problem with the adaptive eye is it's going to mess with your ability to light things. That's just kind of how it works. I don't want the light to be doing anything except exactly what I need it to do at any point in time, right? It better do exactly as I expect. I do not want it to do something that I don't expect, and that means for me, I typically turn it off so that I can get work done. Does everybody kind of understand why I would disable it? I recommend that you do it, and if you want it back, just go ahead. There's no problem with it, right? Post-process volume is your friend. You'll use it a lot. Go ahead.
Do we have to use Lumen for this assignment?
No, I'll let you make a decision. I might still make you guys do a baked version of it, but we'll see what happens when we finish. Kind of depending on how far we get in here. Okay. Go ahead.
This might be a bit of a complicated question, but
I might be able to give you a complicated answer.
yeah, there's obviously games that like use different lighting than Lumen, more so for like a stylized take. Like I don't know if you saw it, but
Hmm?
a few months ago, like a Hellboy game came out, and it was in like the Noah's art style, so all the shadows were like pitch black.
Yeah.
How would you go about like making stylized lighting like that?
Oh, I'd make it in a. If that was me, it'd be a combination of material and. Where's the post-process volume? Where's my blendables here? Exposure. Where is that? Hold on. No, I don't need the convolver here. No, I wouldn't do that. How would I want to do this? Hold on. I wouldn't mess with the cube map. Film grain texture. What do I want to do here? It would probably be a combination of. Let me find where that Where did I put that? I cannot remember where I put that. It's definitely not blendables anymore. We used to call them blendables. I don't want to use the incorrect terminology here because that was an Unreal 4 method. Let me check here. Because the same way that Guilty Gear was kind of made,
Yeah.
it's using a texture that is essentially a, how can I explain it? The material itself is doing a lot of what's happening in the background. It's creating essentially a hard shell, so it's using an edge detect to kind of figure out what it's supposed to do. And the other part of that is, let me try to remember here. It's been a bit since I've had to do anything like that, at least in general. That is the wrong thing. Hold on.
So it's how they do. It's also how they do it in like Guilty Gear and
Mhm.
Dragon Ball Fighters like that. Okay.
Yeah, it's not doing. They're not doing anything too strange. Where is it? It's gonna take me a sec to remember. There it is. Post-processed materials allow you to kind of impose a rule set for how stuff is rendered per se. Post-processed materials can do anything from like impose like a green screen, like an Outlast, to also modifying the textures and the way that they look. If you check out Wayward Rose, which is funnily enough one of the prototype games that came out of this, out of our senior studio, that was done using a shell material, a secondary shell for a character, and also a post-processed volume that allowed the character to look like it had a back shaded behavior. Now, when they were working on that game, the material system did not handle back shading, or shell material as we called it. So they basically made characters with an offset shell in order, and it was painted black. The problem with that is when you have a character, it's rendered twice. Because think of this thing, right? Well, I'm going to copy all the geometry, paste it, and then move the geometry slightly over, and then I'm going to color it black. That creates an edge. So if you take me and then move me slightly over and then color whatever that is, but the problem is it doubles the geometry for every asset that needs that hard backdrop. That was in Unreal 4. Unreal 5 now has access to essentially edge materials, which they allow us to basically control the edge detection, so we don't have to do that anymore. And it looks and runs better if you're just using the material. But essentially, it's a combination of using a material that does edge detect, a post-process volume. What's that?
Lethal Company does that, right? Or the
Lethal Company is in Unity,
Gotcha.
but also, hot take, I don't think he knows what he's doing with. He is doing everything super suboptimally in terms of like his texture work, which is why he manages to find a way to make that game lag on a 4090.
Yeah.
Because he's essentially using really like the most expensive form of lighting, the cheapest form of texturing, but also a processing shader that basically makes everything look kind of weird.
Yeah.
It makes it really expensive. Question.
Why do older games not do well on like newer hardware?
One more time, a little bit louder. I'm sorry.
Why do older games not do well, not run well on like better hardware?
It doesn't work that way. I mean, it does. Some games do, but some games are broken by that. Like for example, a lot of classic games were designed to run on 30. If you run them at 120, they get weird. Things get broken. Like an enemy that was supposed to hit you only once at 30 will hit you 4 times because they just reset very quickly because there's no frame rate independence. frame rate independence was something that we learned after we had all the frames to work with. We'll talk about frame rate independence in the future when we're talking about like performance and whatnot, but why do they not run better? A lot of their architecture is based on like, what do you consider better? More frames? Like that's what we consider better. More frames is not necessarily better per se because we're calculating things based on how many things can happen in a certain frame. Unreal works on the tick system, which is like every frame we get some command or something that we can do. We'll talk about that next week. We're talking about blueprints, assuming that we have enough time. But why don't they run better? They're just not designed to. It doesn't work that way. They don't adaptively detect that the machine is better. They just run the way that they are built within the scope of the things that they were working with. Did you have a question? Okay. All right. But yeah, post-processed materials. I'll demonstrate one here in a little bit. I think you might like it. I usually make like a horror material. We'll talk about that. And I'm sure you guys have already covered things like light functions and whatnot.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, light functions are fun. I like light functions a lot. Moving light functions is usually how I make water and whatnot. So, anyways, let me go ahead and continue here. We'll take a break here shortly. All right, so we've disabled the adaptive eye. Remember, I can go ahead and re-enable it by going it back here and disabling those two. Did everybody see how the light got a little bit weirder? And I can re-enable them. All I'm doing is basically setting the process to both at the same time. I'm going to run through and talk about the lighting process, or rather the lighting tools. I don't want to obsess about each of the lighting tools, but I will talk about what each of the lighting settings do so that people can at least understand what they are physically doing. And then we'll go on break here. So let me go ahead and save. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to delete all of my lights. I need my cloud. I'll delete my skylight. I'll keep the sky atmosphere. Directional light. Ooh, wow, it looks all dark. Don't know why, but sometimes students get really weird when I give them projects with no lights in them. Just go to unlit. That should be the first thing that you do. That's going to be how you check to see if anything is actually physically working. Just remember, abuse your view modes. They're going to be good for you. All right. For the purpose of making this as easy as possible, I'm just going to go ahead and enable the Place Actors panel so people can see the lighting. These are all the lights that you get. You don't need any more. In fact, you probably have more than you need. I do a lot with point lights and directional lights and just in general. And then we'll talk about mobility and whatnot. Before we get into lumen, or before we get into light mass, there is only one rule for lights with lumen. All lights are treated as real time. That's it. Which means that you have real-time shadows, real-time lighting, real-time global illumination. That's it. It doesn't matter what your mobility is set at. I'm going to ignore talking about mobility until it gets relevant, okay? You probably already know how mobility works, but mobility is actually somewhat of a complicated concept to explain to people who are just new to lighting. This is why lumen is great. It ignores mobility for lighting and just says, hey, all your lights are real time. Cool. You don't ever have to worry about the lighting. If you get a warning, it's because lumen is high. Just ignore the warning. It'll look as fine as it does. Or follow it and it'll tell you how to fix the warning. It'll be fine. Everybody has already seen the directional light. It's a sun. But notice how with no skylight you get no lighting in the shadows. In order for you to get good outdoor, typically good outdoor lighting, the directional light is basically going to be necessary with a skylight. There is no way around it. Let me go ahead and drag a skylight in here. Give that a sec to cook. Come on. There we go. Whoop. 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 So everybody see that interaction? They both work together. Mr. Figueroa, why didn't they build them both into each other? Because they behave differently depending on what's actually physically happening in the world. The skylight is a little bit weirder in the sense that the skylight requires a sky. If we disable the skylight, or we disable the sky and delete the sky sphere, so if we were to take the sky sphere and remove it, and remove the clouds and the sky atmosphere, the skylight would stop working. The skylight requires something to capture the lighting from up above. So That's something to keep in mind. Most students don't run into that, but just keep that in mind. You don't get the sun without directional and skylight. It is just how that works. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining your directional or your skylight here, because it should be without explanation. I already explained how you can go ahead and rotate around or use Control L to figure out what your button is supposed to be, or what direction your lighting is supposed to be. All lighting is done in lumens, unless it's done in another method for another reason. I'll talk about that when we get to point lights. When you're dealing with your directional light, does anyone know the actual lumens of a sunny afternoon? Partly cloudy? Is it 10 lumens? It's definitely not. You're getting closer to 35,000 lumens and higher, depending on where you're located. So why does the game default to using low lumen value? In fact, if I go ahead and reset this, I think, oh, no, I just dragged this in fresh and it's at 10 lumens already. That's not enough for real world lighting. This is because the way that the engine operates is it generally operates within the lower range of the lumen value range in order for your environment to look good, right? There's almost no reason why you would want to set up your lighting to be 100% accurate, but let me show you why what happens happens. That's 35,000 lumens. That's a sunny afternoon. Now the reason why we can't see is the exact same reason why you can see when you go outside. Your eyes adapt. With eye adaptation turned on, you'd be able to see again. Let me hit Q so I can select my thing. Let me turn on eye adaptation by disabling these things. Come on, let's give it a minute. It's trying. We should be fully adapted now, but unfortunately it's still not enough. Let's go ahead and see what it's actually physically doing. Yep, we are way into error. We cannot adapt any further. However, we can use exposure compensation. Where are you? Ah, no! It's too much. The adaptive eye is trying to figure it out. To compensate for the exposure in general. What I'm telling folks is don't use real world lighting conditions unless you absolutely need to. When would you actually need to use real world lighting? If for some reason you are using a real world lighting scale with your other lights, and even for virtual production, the lights can't hit that value. You can't reproduce the sun. And because of that, most cameras can't even record the sun. Well, you can if you want to. I'm sure everybody's seen on TikTok where somebody was recording the sun and then the sensor got like a little burn on it. It's just not a good idea. That gives you an idea of why we don't use real world scale, at least by default in Unreal. The most I'll ever do for like a sunny afternoon in a video game in Unreal is usually around anywhere from 24 to 32 lumens. It gives you some overhead to be able to flex the lighting in the direction that you need. The more light you have, the more what I refer to as lighting overhead you have. Which means that splotchiness, weirdness, stuff that might happen in your lighting, most of that goes away. But it also creates other issues in other places, like with your exposure. Here, in fact, let me apply that glow. What's going on there? Can anyone tell me why it's black?
It's Vanta Black.
What's that?
It's Vanta Black.
It's not Vanta Black. It's that green glow that I just used to demonstrate lumen inside the building. Why is that black? Think of the values that we're using right now for the sun. I said it's a 20.
It's not emitting anything high.
Exactly. The sun is basically so powerful that the way that the math lines up, it says that, well, it might as well be absorbing light as opposed to reflecting light.
That's what my question was during that too.
Mhm.
Was that like, is the math already done within Lumen, like a ratio of like what real world lighting is to our eye
Mhm.
versus the
Although this is when it goes out of bounds, this is what happens. This is called crushing. This is indicative of a problem. What's happening is like similar to if you go outside and turn on your cell phone light. You can see the little LED light up, right? But can you go outside in the sunny afternoon and turn on your cell phone light and light something up? Can you even see the light? Unless you get it real close, no. Same reason. You had a question?
Would you have to set it to a lower value?
I have to set it to a much higher value to compete with the sun itself. Or I could just set this back to a normal value and I should be able to get my value back. Let me go ahead and reset my exposure count. I'm blind.
Oh, the sun was set at.
The sun is still at 35,000. I'm gonna set this back to default. And you see that I'm not making it up. It's just a matter of different extreme values. Okay. Let me go ahead and reset this back to its default color. As you see, it takes a second for Lumen to clean up. I'm going to go ahead and delete directional light. Everybody loves the point light. The point light is probably the most useful and versatile light in the engine. I like it. It works really well. Let me demonstrate some of its weirdness. And in order to demonstrate its weirdness, I actually need to do this. Why are you fighting me? Let's do, oh, I forgot in this version of Unreal I can hard code these. Ah, I hate that. Oh, I hate that it already has. That's gonna weird me out. I'm not used to using the values in here. As of early Unreal 5, it didn't have those values that were baked in. Now those values are baked into the node over on the right. I'm trying to break the habit of doing that. You can go ahead and hard code it in here. Let me go ahead and save that. That looks shiny enough. That looks like a cube.
Is that Chrome?
That's about as chrome as I can get it. Something something shiny and chrome, something something Valhalla. Okay, let me go ahead and apply that. Whoop. Mr. Figueroa, why did you make a reflective surface? Because it's the best way to see what's happening with the light. Go figure. I've got my friend the point light here. Point lights are not measured in lumens, although you can force the lumen values. Point lights are typically measured in CD. Does anyone know what CD knows? I know you know what CD is. You know what CD is?
Maybe. I don't.
Who knows what CD is? And no, if anyone says what I think they're thinking, please don't. I've had someone do that in a high school class before. They were like, no. I'm like, no, I'm not going to see those. Candle power.
Oh.
Candelas. Candle power. Candle power is a measure of a 1 inch wick, I believe at 1 foot, for the amount of light that is emitted. You can, in fact, change the value of intensity units right here. Don't use unitless. Unitless is like the vibes of light. It just lets you crank up the power and like it doesn't attribute any value. It just gives you how much light. Throw a number in there. We have unitless, candles, lumens, or exposure value. Typically EV is going to be used for virtual production because they have cameras that can record a certain EV. Lumens and candles are going to be fine. Lumens is your lux. Lumens is a higher measure of logarithmic light. It's just more space for lighting. I'm going to continue to use candle power. I don't need to explain intensity. I really hope I don't need to explain intensity. I really hope I don't need to explain light color.
Disco, RGB.
Attenuation radius And source radius, I should explain though. Attenuation radius is not the overall radius of the lighting. In fact, if I make the attenuation radius really wide, does anyone know why the lighting does not go out to the edge of the attenuation? Question.
Because it's a point light?
We run out of power. We only have technically 21 candles located in a small area, and we just simply run out of power before we get to the edge of the attenuation radius. This is essentially the ability for your light to go into a fall off distance. If we increase the lighting but decrease the fall off, you'll see that there is a kind of curl over where the attenuation radius will have more power than the attenuation will have. It becomes more like a spotlight per se, but it is not a true spotlight, but that gives you an idea of how much you can do. You can even put in manual numbers if you'd like. That basically creates a slightly harder edge, but you get the idea. I'm going to go ahead and return these values to default. Your source radius controls the size of the source. Now, the reason why I have a pure reflective surface is so that you can see this. That does have influence on reflective objects in the Unreal Engine. And what if I told you that everything in the Unreal Engine starts at a 0.5 specularity, so everything is slightly wet. So this, while you may not be able to see that result, it does affect the way that the lighting works in your scene. Because it's essentially your light bulb is now this big. Sure, your candle power is the same, right? But the surface area of the emitted light is larger, and therefore it does have an impact on the way that surfaces are going to see that light. The reason why I'm using a reflective surface here is so that you can see what is happening. If I move that reflective surface, you won't be able to see what is actually occurring. But this does matter for objects that are more reflective, if that makes any sense. Let's go back to our light here. I'm going to leave the source radius. Soft source radius controls the overall fall off of the actual light itself. So that seems really strange that you can control not just the attenuation radius, but the attenuation radius of the surface of a fake virtual light. Why would you want to do that? Believe it or not, most of the time you're going to be playing with those four options to get your lighting to look perfect. Because I will say that the point light by default is crap. It just is not a good looking light. It's too harsh. It doesn't work in most cases. You're going to want to play around with your lighting a little bit, at least your attenuation radius and your fall off radius, in order to get the correct results for your scene. I'm going to reset these now. Source length is pretty obvious. Let me turn this sideways. And let me increase the source radius here. And increase the soft source. Congratulations, you now have a hot dog light. But if you're wondering, right, that's how you create that.
Ceiling lamp?
Fluorescent, they call it.
Or you could, well, that has a diffuser on it.
Why is the light source still round, even though it's shapeless?
That's just kind of how the end result looks. Let me go ahead and increase the attenuation radius, and let me kind of illustrate what's happening by moving this over. It's very rare, and I think the problem with a lot of this is it's very rare for lights to exist floating in the world. They don't work that way. Lights have to plug in somewhere. And that immediately creates a hard attenuation in the direction that it's actually plugged in. What we have here is a virtual light that's floating out in space with nothing to attenuate it except itself. That's always going to look a little weird. I think that's the thing that people need to kind of work through in order to understand that, yeah, it's just the point of light that has an infinite source that is like basically a point.
If you're lighting a light source in a room and you're trying to make a lamp turn on, would you be able to see the lamp like lit up in the render?
Can you ask that again but differently? I'm not patronizing you, I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to solve.
Are you able to see the light object in the render rather than seeing it in
what you would do, I think, is you would put the light like in the object. Like
Yeah.
you'd have to actually model your, like if you wanted it to be like the tube, you'd have to model
Any
the tube.
when lighting goes inside of any object, any penetration disables the object. So if you put a light inside of a thing, it disables the interaction, so it won't cast a shadow.
So
Or you can make your light big enough.
so it would be best to use probably like silver if you're just thinking about that.
What if I tell you that when I make lights, I don't I'm not after accuracy, I'm after the simulacra. I'm after what it's supposed to look like. I'm not a cop. If the light is not directly inside of the light bulb of a lamp on a desk, no one's gonna check. You know what I typically do? I typically set a large environment light that just kind of lights everything the way that I want it to. If I need a specific shadow, you know what I'll do? It gets two lights. One that casts a shadow and one that fills the area. I care mostly about achieving what the look of the scene is supposed to look like. When we have that room, we don't have to worry about whether or not it's accurate, right? We have to worry more about like whether or not the player can see. I'll demonstrate that during the next demo coming up. But typically speaking, like if I need a very specific shadow, I'll use a light to cast the shadow and I'll use another light to create the actual area light that I need. No one's stopping you from using multiple lights. Ask Grant about his Cistern project if you ever get a chance to. There's a lot of weird lighting tricks that he used to get the overall look, and I think that's probably one of his best pieces from his student work, if not his best piece, period. Because he did a lot of really smart technical stuff to kind of make the light look as good as it does, and it just does work. Anyways, source length. No, you can't scale them. All scaling does is it scales the attenuation radius. You have to control that down here. Color temperature is just the color temperature. For those of you who understand the galvanic rules of lighting, go ahead.
Why is color temperature its own thing and not just the color of the light?
Because color temperature is physically accurate, whereas color of the light is a tint, if you can call it that. Tints and light affectation, for example, we can combine both methods. We can emit a warmer light using a filament. Filament lights are typically going to be around 3,000 to 35, maybe even 38. It starts to clean up a little bit more. But your old style filament lighting is going to be yellower. When you start getting in fluorescent or LEDs, LEDs are tinted to be yellower because the light is crispier. We can in fact combine the light color value here to add a value, and yeah, look, we are getting a red color, but we are getting the influence of the color temperature into it. Do you see kind of how that works? So having two handles to work with gives you more precision, although typically color temperature is going to be used mostly for architectural work or something specific. I typically just use light color. Unless for whatever reason you need to use a very specific light color, the galvanic scale is just there for just giving you control over it. For those of you who do not know the Kelvin scale, it's based on how hot they run. Now these rules get a little bit weird because the sun is weird. The sun emits pure light, but the sun is biased because it uses, it's basically a reaction, and it's biased towards orange or yellow. But the sun's light is actually something like, I forget, like something very pure in terms of like just white light. It becomes yellow because of our atmosphere and whatnot, but you get the idea. When would you want to use this? Typically in virtual production, if you're trying to reproduce a light, specific light. I just usually use the light color. Let's go back here. Where is that? Oh my gosh. Something that I like doing, but I always forget where that setting is. There it is. Something that's incredibly useful, and I think students underutilize, is forcing lights out of the renderer whenever possible. I've removed the light from the reflection by reducing its specularity scale. Why would you want to do this? I don't know. If you're trying to hide the lights from the reflection surface, but you have a very specific look that you're going to do, hell yeah, I'm going to set up a bunch of lights that do just this so that I can get the lighting in the scene perfect, and then it'll look like there's only one light in the reflection. Again, there are no rules that say that you have to physically have all the lights in the environment that you have in a room. The rule is only whether or not it looks good. If your reflections look weird, well then just disable them. It's not, there is no crime, you know? There's no crime for messing with any of these settings down here. I typically don't tell new users to use any of the advanced settings, at least for now. But if you ever need to disable a light in the reflection, feel free to ask. I'll tell you how to do it. All lights are essentially adhering to all of the same rules. The only difference here is the spotlight has a couple of different settings. Let me increase the spotlight here. They're all relatively the same, except with the spotlight you have an inner cone and an outer cone. That's how you can get your really, really sharp edge, if you really need one. Even though it has source radius, let me go ahead and move this over here so we can see it. And let me move the point light out of the way. And let me move this so I can actually see this. Source radius on a point light creates a weird effect. Don't recommend it. Soft source radius, same thing, but it offers that effect within the cone. Do you kind of see how when I moved that, it almost like wants to creep up towards the emission? Source length doesn't do a whole lot when it comes to a spotlight, because you get your source length that creates this kind of behavior. It's really tough to control, but it does work. And then of course you have access to things like here. Again, they're all the same options, except the different lights are going to behave differently. And the last one that I want to cover before we go out on break, I don't have to spend too much time explaining it, is the rect light. I hate this light. Unless I'm doing something specific with it, I don't think it's inherently very useful. The rect light is designed to essentially have what's called barn dooring. The barn door essentially controls how that cutoff is going to behave. Why would you want something like this? It's great for backlighting. It's great for backlighting a scene or for creating light in a square shape in a specific direction / orientation, but it is not really good for like interactions in games because it's really obvious where it starts and where it finishes. It might be good in a room that doesn't have the ability to go behind the light. Your mileage may vary, but we can do the same stuff with the point light in general. This light can accept, here in fact I'll demonstrate it, this light can accept a texture, but it's really mostly a reflection, or really it's mostly for, let me increase the height here so we can see it. Let me find a texture I can use. Come on, are you gonna work? No, it doesn't like that. No, come on, work. One of these will work. Let me find one that might give us a better result. There we go. I have never seen a case where you would want to do something like that to put a reflection color in the actual lighting itself. People are like, "Oh, what if you wanted to do a stained glass like on the ground?" Well, I would make a light function for that. But this more or less covers at least most of the tools that are available in the Unreal Engine. The last thing before we go on break here, I apologize to keep saying that, before I forget, is if you are bringing in a brand new directional light and you are bringing in a skylight, by default, that skylight is going to have its real-time capture disabled. The reason why real-time capture exists by default in the Unreal Editor is real-time capture allows you to essentially create a slightly better, let's call it slightly better behavior for Lumen. It does not work well with anything else. Does everybody see that the reflections got a little bit better? That's it. That's all it really does. It gives you the ability to kind of control how that works. We can, in fact, make our own cube map and our own HDR lighting, but that really deals mostly with virtual production. I used to cover it a little bit more. If people are interested in seeing like maybe an HDR backdrop or anything like that, I can definitely show it. But typically, we just kind of use sky spheres when it comes to games in general, and we apply a texture to a sky sphere in order for it to look decent. And that's where most of your work is going to be on in games. If you're using the cube map, it's going to be specifically for lighting something. It's going to be for like scene lighting or lighting and viewing an object, so on and so forth. But let's go ahead and wrap this conversation up for now before we get into the next portion of this where I'm discussing Lumen. I'm going to go ahead and clean up my scene during the break. Or excuse me, not Lumen, Light Mass. And we'll talk about why baking exists, why I think it's superior in some ways, why it's inferior in some ways, and then we'll move on to some of the texture stuff. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Come back at 9, it's 43, so let's just say 55, and we'll call it good. All right? See you in a few minutes.
Are they more?
The rocks, yeah, they're in the same pack. And the
Let me
grass,
go ahead and
I got
continue
like
here,
one
folks.
asset pack.
They're all part of the same pack.
Have you heard from Marcel?
Marcel, I've not spoken to him in an hour.
I already texted him today.
Let me go ahead and clean this up a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more.
Saw him last night. He was supposed to show today. So, or he gets back in 6 minutes.
Unfortunately, I got an asset pack for trees, rocks, grass, bushes. Unfortunately, that's all that was included. The other asset packs from the same creator in the same style, but they charged a lot for them. This was the only free one they had, so.
Did you,
All right. Sorry about cutting off the conversation, folks. I'm gonna continue because I've got a lot more that I need to cover here. One thing to keep in mind is that even with no lighting, let me disable the directional light and let me disable the skylight here. Do I have my skylight? Did I bring one in? Am I crazy? No, I'm not. Is that in a lot of cases, you'll have to deal with the lighting that comes from the exponential height fog. Depending on whether or not the fog itself has any interscattering, the exponential height fog is treated in some cases as a light, but it is not a light. Does everybody see how everything looks lit up? But it is not lit up. There is no light. The exponential height fog is typically used to give you volumetrics and to add depth to light, but it itself is not a light, but it is also not a light, if that makes sense. It's not a light, but it captures light. But it doesn't emit light, but it ignores the lighting rules. It's weird in the sense that, well, Mr. Figueroa, why do we have exponential height fog? Because when you get exponential fog, you can start going into the realm of doing things like the God rays. You can start doing the things like, when a light beam creates like a cutout, and like when you turn on a flashlight during a misty evening, stuff like that. Right now, what you're seeing is the exponential height fog contributing to the environment. Typically, your exponential height fog is going to be black because it's going to reflect only what is physically in the skylight. That's how Unreal works by default. But as soon as you do anything related with the fog, and I'll demonstrate that when we get to our actual environment, the fog immediately tries to contribute to the overall lighting. And in fact, let me go ahead and let me delete the rest of these lights so you can see that there's no lights in the scene, and I'm not lying to anybody. There are no lights in the scene, and the two major lights are disabled. If I enable the directional light, you see that the light comes back. But you can see that there is light in the scene, but that's coming from the exponential height fog, and it's not even really light, it's just influence. I'm going to go ahead and crush that down to black and continue my explanation here. Alright, so I've explained how Lumen works, why it's good, why I think it's an easier tool to use, because really, you set it and you forget it. Get the lighting right, get the color right, you're good to go. Everything else is done through post-processing. Go ahead.
So that exponential height fog is the fog effect to be used for lighting, or
One more time?
the exponential height fog? It's like that. Sorry,
Exponential height fog.
It's a fog effect to be used with lighting, like it.
Essentially, yeah. But also, it doesn't emit light, therefore it can be used
Right.
without lighting.
It can be used without lighting. Okay.
Which is weird because it contributes to light, it affects light, but it is not a light,
Right.
and it ignores lighting rules because it's not a light, but it affects light.
It manipulates it. Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's just like another layer to be added. Most of the time, you'll want one in your scene just to add a little bit of sky dust, if you want to call it that. Only if you're doing like things like outdoor scenes, stuff like that. It's not always necessary, but it does help. You probably don't have, I'm pretty sure you have one in your scene from what I can see at least. Anyways, let's talk about moving away from Lumen for now. Why would you want to move away from Lumen? You might want to move away from Lumen because you're working on a game that is going to be on a console or on a system that cannot handle Lumen. You might want to move away from Lumen because realistically, Lumen is going to perform worse than Lightmass. Lightmass by default is always going to perform better, and when it comes to games, we really care about performance in a lot of those ways. Lightmass is not very simple to enable, but it is enabled if Lumen is disabled. So, if you want to permanently disable Lumen, you can always go back up into here, Project Settings. We're going to go down to Rendering, and I'm going to change the dynamic global illumination from Lumen to none. I'm not going to change it here. Reflection method from Lumen to screen space, which is the default in Lightmass. And I'm going to change the shadow map method from virtual shadow maps to shadow maps. Now, we'll talk about this in the future, but I'm not going to do it in this screen because you can, funnily enough, our friend, the post-process volume, has the ability to change the global illumination and the reflection method built right into it. I prefer the post-process volume when editing anything. Post-process volume overrides project settings, believe it or not. It's great for doing any changes or tests immediately. For example, I'm going to go ahead and turn Lumen Visualizer on. We see that Lumen is working, but I'm going to disable it by changing the GI method from Lumen to none. And you saw that it immediately turned Lumen off. Lumen is right now off, just because I changed the GI method to none. I'm also going to follow it up by changing the reflection method to screen space. Why are you mad at me? There's no lights. There we go. And just so I have some lighting, I'm going to go ahead and enable directional light and skylight. Now, because I am not going to be using lumen, the sky isn't really contributing to my overall lighting, except in the sense that it's costing more to look good. I'm probably going to use a sky sphere. Probably be the best way to do it. Or I can go ahead and go up here, delete the sky sphere, delete the sky atmosphere, delete the volumetric clouds, and I'm going to go ahead and convert this over to more like a game-oriented project to try to grab all the performance back that Lumen was using. Lumen loves the sky atmosphere. And in fact, you can see a skylight with real-time capture is enabled in the scene. It requires at least a sky atmosphere, a volumetric cloud, and a material tagged as iSky, otherwise it will be black. I'm moving away from Lumen, so I'm going to go ahead and solve this problem right away. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my engine content because I know it's in here. And I'm going to go ahead and search for my there you go, BP Sky Sphere. All right. I'm just going to drag that into the scene. Cool. I'm going to give the BP Sky Sphere a directional light because it's looking for the directional light that's in our scene. Cool. Come on, stop lagging. Now our environment looks a little bit weird. Let me make sure that my sky sphere is set at the correct location. I'm just going to reset the value so that the sky sphere is located at 0, 0, 0. The scale looks fine. And now I'm going to solve the rest of the problem by changing the fog interscattering color. And I'm going to reduce the fog density until I get something that looks like that. Just so that I have something that I can kind of work with. And if I want to move it down, I can go ahead and move the fog down. It is dependent on where it's supposed to be located. And now I'm going to fix the on-screen error by disabling real-time capture. Congratulations! Lumen is now fully disabled, and now Lightmass is the default system. This is where we have to talk about lighting mobility. Now remember, what are all lights treated as if Lumen is on? Good?
Real time.
Real time. Which means you don't have to worry about any of the performance or mobility settings for the editor. That's fine. That's great. That's why Lumen is great, because then most people are not necessarily willing to kind of spend time to learn the different mobility settings. For the purpose of this, I'm going to go ahead and disable, or rather delete my skylight so that I only have one light in the scene. Let me go ahead and rotate this light around. As you can see, it's weirdly cursed with how it actually physically looks. Alright, that looks fine. I've got my adaptive hide turned off. And move this over so I can move this in a slightly different direction. Here we go. That's going to be fine over there. I'm going to do the first part of setting up any kind of lighting in general, which means that we need to figure out what our mobility is going to be at. Welcome to mobility settings for your lighting. If you mouse over the different mobilities, it tells you exactly what they're going to do. Most people will probably be comfortable setting all of their lights to stationary rather than fully movable or static. In fact, I'll explain this one pretty simply. I'm going to go ahead and change my lighting to static here. And if you change any of your mobility and you're using Lightmass, the only way that you're going to be able to see your changes is if you bake. Does everybody see how I changed my lighting? I only have one light in the scene, directional light. I changed my lighting mobility, and does everybody see what's happening with my lighting in general? Does everybody see what's happening with the shadows? It's giving what's called a preview light. That's telling you that, hey, your lighting has changed its mobility, and therefore the preview that you are seeing is not the exact version of the shadow that you're going to see. Questions?
So how do you go from Lumen to Lightmass again?
All I did was if you want to go ahead and do that in the project settings, you can. I personally used the post-process volume and I went into global illumination down in the post-process volume and set the method to none and reflections to screen space. Now the other thing that I forgot to mention, because I always forget to mention it, I apologize because I always forget to say this, is I have this box set to infinite extents unbound. That's what makes this a little bit easier. If I disable this setting right here, the only time I'm going to disable Lumen, see how Lumen immediately re-engages itself, is when I'm inside this box. You never want to do this in a game because this is obscenely expensive. Now, Mr. Figueroa, can I just enable Lumen and then use Lightmaster? No, do not do that. It doesn't. The engine does not want to switch lighting solutions at any given point in time. You got to stick with one. Question?
Why do you use the volume instead of just going to project settings?
Because the volume is fun and I like the volume. And it's easier to change the settings because I could do this very quickly. I could just go into the already modified properties, and then if I need to test something, I can just change whatever I need very quickly. If it's going to be enshrined in the final version of the project, it should be in the project settings. If you're demoing like I am, post-process volume will be fine. Post-process volume is powerful and it does everything I need to, but the results are the same. So disabling it in the project settings is going to be smarter in the long run if you have no intention of going back, and you kind of get the idea, right? But since I'm demoing it, it's easier for me to use the post-process volume. That volume just overrides all the settings anyways. Let me go ahead and set my, I forgot to set its infinite extents to unbound. I usually type in unbound here. And that makes the box infinite, so that's why it goes out to the very edges. It doesn't change the size, but it changes its effect to affect everything all the way to the edge of the world. Alright, so since Lumen is disabled, a good way to tell is one, if your Lumen view doesn't show anything, assume that you're seeing the Lightmass version. The other check you should make is to make sure that your engine scalability is high or above. If Lumen is not enabled because of your engine scalability, you may get weird results because the engine knows that Lumen is on, but your scalability is preventing you from seeing it. Make sure that if you are testing it, check that first. Go ahead.
How do you change scalability?
Scalability is changed over here in your settings by going into your engine scalability settings right there. You can set auto. This machine prefers to be at high. Epic is the default. Cinematic is rarely used. Alright, I'm going to do the first thing to demonstrate the Lightmass system. I set my light to static, and I'm going to go ahead and go to build, and I'm going to build lighting only. You can build all levels. It includes lighting in your build. A quick note, these settings right here, this does affect your overall baking time. We'll talk about that when we're getting ready to do a full-on bake, so on and so forth. I'm just going to go ahead, and that's got a hotkey, Control-Shift semicolon, and I'm going to bake. As you can see, the firewall is going to want access. Does everybody see this little icon at the bottom right? The swarm agent. Please do not quarantine the swarm agent. I always get at least one student who lets antivirus quarantine it. Do not let your antivirus quarantine swarm agent. You will break Lightmass. Let me allow access to it. Give it a sec to figure out its nonsense. Welcome to Lightmass, and why Lightmass is kind of a mess. Lightmass relies on predetermined settings in order for the shadows to gain a certain amount of resolution or a certain amount of, let's say, overhead. A good rule of thumb is don't ever use static on your directional lights. Just don't. There's no way to improve that shadow. unless you really crank up the size of the shadow map, or excuse me, the light map. We'll talk about that here in a sec. So what I've done is I'm no longer getting a warning. If I hit play, I shouldn't be getting a warning. Oh, my character's really upset because I've got the wrong character in the scene, but you get the idea. Let me go ahead and simulate that so that I can... Yeah, oh, third person character is compiling weird. I know why. I can fix that later. But you see that we're getting like really ugly, really splotchy shadows. But let me go ahead and show what's actually physically happening. If you go into your settings and world settings, and we go ahead and go down here into our light mass option, it should be the third option down, you have the ability to mess with your light mass settings. This is basically like adding render samples for those of you who use Maya. If we scroll down to advanced, we can see that there are light maps available to visualize. I'm going to go ahead and open them, and I'm going to open the very first one right here, HQ light map 0_1, and I'm going to go ahead and disable everything except for the red channel. Congratulations! This is the entire world currently compressed into a 2D shadow map. I mean, we can see our front door, the light coming through the front door over at the bottom left, that black area right over there. What essentially happens is when you're using light mass, light is no longer treated as real time. All shadows are going to be cooked down to a texture, which means that you are at the mercy of the texture resolution in order for your shadows, whether or not they're crispy or otherwise. In this particular case, this is probably the most extreme version of this. My advice is to simply never set your scalability, or excuse me, your mobility for any kind of lighting that is this large to static. Static basically says fully baked, fastest rendering. So when would you want to use static lighting? Believe it or not, you're doing like a cartoony game that doesn't have any shadows in general, or if you're making a side scroller, they don't have shadows, or if you're making a game that is like top down, etc. Why would you need shadows? Why would you need any kind of shadows? If you're using a stylized look, so on and so forth, all your lights should be static. There's no reason why not. Go ahead.
So I'm trying to use the build lighting, and it gives me a bunch of overlapping UV errors. Is that
That's just the asset.
okay?
You can ignore that.
Ignore that.
You can safely ignore that if they look okay. Now, I'm going to demonstrate what is actually physically happening here. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and change the color of the lighting. Here, someone said green earlier. Orange? Okay, we'll do orange. It's more like a burnt umber. Look at what's happening with our preview. Now check this out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to bake again. Control-Shift semicolon. As you can see, lighting needs to be rebuilt because I changed the lighting. You see that warning at the top left. I'm going to let this cook down. Okay. Now the entire world is orange because the baked lighting has cooked itself into the world. I'm going to go ahead and reset the lighting. Does everybody see what's happening? Why is everything orange if there is no orange light?
Still baked into the world.
Exactly. This is something that's going to screw up every student that uses light mask, because eventually you'll forget that you need to do a bake. You'll get really used to what something looks like, you'll bake, and then it's going to look like crap. So I generally encourage people to be very careful about how their light maps, or rather how their baked lighting is going to look in general. Go ahead, okay, and reset that. So we can see that the lighting is in fact trying its best to compensate for the fact that we've already added our bake. I'm going to also do this. Does everyone see that we currently, look at this. I only have a directional light in the scene. I've disabled that directional light by poking out its eye. Why is it not dark?
Still baked.
Same reason, we have baked the lighting into the scene surfaces. that is also another thing that is going to be hazardous for students because they're thinking, oh, wait a second, why can't I still see? Why are my lights not having any effect? What's going on? Light mask is about cooking that information onto all of the surfaces available in the environment. The reason why it performs better than lumen is simply because it just bakes better. It just looks, it's not going to be performing in real time, but what it does is it imposes, I'll get to you in a sec, it imposes the current light settings onto all the assets in the world, and it saves on your performance. Just disabling lumen, you'll see probably a jump of anywhere from 10 to 20 FPS, simply because lumen has a floor cost, which means in order for it to be running, it has a certain amount of cost. Lumen is always going to be slower than light mask. Question?
So would you have to decrease the light max?
I don't understand how to answer your question because I don't. How do you mean decrease light mask?
Like in order for the map to run better.
There's no real way to. Light mass is just a name. It's not actually a mass. Light mass is a process. It's just the name of what they call their old lighting structure. Or it's not really older. It's just different, right? Question?
So this would just need to be rebaked and then applied
Right.
in order to change it. That's the only.
Exactly. I've changed it back to white already, and I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick rebake. Control Shift semicolon. Give that a sec to cook down. And it's back to normal. Now the reason why this performs well is because we're cooking all that information into the shadow or into the shader itself.
So how do you know that you've switched from lumen to light mask? Because
If you disable lumen at all and it doesn't show up, you can assume that lumen is disabled.
I did don't think I thought to disable it, but I'm still getting. I can change the color and it'll change immediately.
That's because your light is set to stationary.
Okay.
Am I wrong?
Yes. No, not wrong.
Let me talk about the different mobility settings as we move up. So we've talked about what static lighting does. Question?
So if all the light is in real time, how do moving actors not have shadows?
I like where you're thinking. Let me bring in an actor and we'll make it a test actor. And we're going to set this actor's mobility to movable. All assets, or rather all actors on the stage, have the ability to have access to mobility settings, except for skeletal meshes. Skeletal meshes are assumed to be movable. That's the only rule. Everything else, every asset, it's called a static mesh because it's assumed to not be moving, but every mesh or every actor can be set to movable. Now check this out. This asset can move, but notice that it's not giving us a drop shadow. Let's see if I can force it. I'm just going to go ahead and put it somewhere. I'm going to do a quick rebake. It might not give me a shadow at all because it's currently being treated as a character, and therefore it won't generate a shadow. But if I go ahead and do this, there we go. Characters in a static lighting scenario, or rather moving objects in a static lighting scenario, will not cast a drop shadow. You know what we do for that? We fake it with like a black ring or like something that follows into the character. We fake it. We don't really do that anymore because that used to be what we have to do back in the day. And then of course if the character jumped, we would just scale that smaller, right? We don't have to do that anymore. Let me go ahead and move this back. And let me change the mobility of the lighting here. So static lighting is usually going to be used for lights that only contribute to a scene when you are using light masks. So if you need a static light for whatever reason, here, let me go ahead and demonstrate that. L left click will make a point light, for example. And I'm going to go ahead and set this as a static light. I know it's going to be mad, and I'll go ahead and change the color. so people can see it. Now it's mad. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick bake. A static light using light mask is going to be the cheapest light possible because it's not going to be real time and it's just going to put color in the scene. If I delete this light, no, don't delete the light and then try to sell the game this way. The engine will be like, wait, where am I getting this lighting from? Control-Shift semicolon to rebuild. I know it's mad because I just added it back in. You get the idea. I'm illustrating why the rules of light masks are the way that they are. Most of your games are going to be using light masks for lighting because light masks will give you back that performance. It's just how it works. Alright, light mask is working. Yep, everything looks fine. Oh, that looks terrible. That's fine. We'll figure that out in a sec. But you get the idea. Let me go ahead and change the mobility of our directional light to something a little bit more palatable. I'm going to change the directional light to stationary. When you change lighting mobility, you have to rebuild. You don't have to rebuild immediately, but you better put it in the back of your head that, hey, I just changed lighting mobility. Let me go ahead and do a quick bake, Control-Shift semicolon, to impose my changes. Stationary lights are lights that have properties of both static lighting, which is like that cheap baked lighting, but also it has access to something called a cascaded shadow map. Think of it as a low lighting, medium lighting, high lighting. Does everybody see that our shadow has improved? Oh, we're getting some light bleed there. That's fantastic. Welcome to Lumen. Or welcome to Light Mask, sorry. Notice that we are getting a much crispier, nicer, more accurate shadow. That's because when you are using a stationary light and you are using light masks. Go back to world settings. Does everyone see that we now have this thing called a shadow map texture that wasn't there before? A shadow map texture is a higher resolution form of shadowing that becomes available when you are using a stationary light. For a sunlight, like a directional light or a light that definitely has to cast shadows, a stationary light should probably be what you use all the time. In fact, if you don't know why you need to use a static light, just don't use it. Stationary is going to be your friend. It performs well, it gives you nice shadows, because it makes distinctions on what objects are going to have those cascaded shadow maps. Lumen doesn't give you the option to make a decision, because there are no shadow maps in Lumen. Lumen just makes real-time shadows. That's why it's expensive. When you're using cascaded shadow maps using light masks, it costs a little bit more, but if your machine cell phones can run this, okay? Like there's no reason why not to use cascaded shadow maps. If we were talking 15 years ago, I'd be like, whoa, I don't know if the PS2, PS3 can run that all the time. But now we've got all this, we've got a lot of horsepower, and most cell phones have graphics processors that can run shadows. You don't have to worry about that. But it does pay to understand what is physically happening. You get better shadows, you get better lighting, and objects that are movable now have movable shadows. That is the most expensive shadow right there on the ground next to the sphere that we have marked as the character. Because that light, because the way that stationary lights work, it has processes of both movable and static behavior. Any object in a stationary environment or a stationary lighting scenario that is tagged as moving will have a real-time shadow. Mr. Figueroa, what's the whole point if it's going to cost that's going to be that small? It's small. Question.
Yeah, you mentioned like that this is the most expensive shadow.
No, as in just in the scene,
Yeah.
Not literally the most expensive overall, but just
in the scene.
Yeah, in the scene.
How like if you had something like that, would that like really heavily affect optimization or not really?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Like if you have, it's already optimized to say right now with a stationary light, static objects are going to cast a shadow map.
Okay. So
And that has its own performance savings.
even and and then once you scale it up, say like since I'm doing the subway station,
Mhm.
if I wanted to, I don't know, make the subway car move,
Mhm.
right?
Just have the car movable.
Okay, and the shadows would follow. Like if I had the moving shadows as well, that also wouldn't impact, like.
I mean, there is a performance cost to setting an object to movable because it changes the rules for that shadow from instead of being a cascaded shadow map to just being a real-time shadow. That is a real-time shadow. That little circle right there is considered real-time. It is the only real-time shadow in this scene, but that comes with a real-time cost. But it's not like if you use a drop of hot dog water will corrupt a gallon of clean.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way.
Gotcha.
The more precise, the less real-time shadow you have, the more well performing it's going to be. If you have a 3D game and your character doesn't have a shadow, you already kind of made a mistake. It probably should have a shadow. It'll be digitized, it'll be kind of weirder looking, but nonetheless, it's still cheaper to let one character or a handful of characters have their own real-time shadows than to have everything in the scene be a real-time shadow, if that makes any sense. That's just kind of, we say what we can. The only reason a building should have, for a game, should have real-time lighting is if you're really looking for the real-time look, right? Question?
So like light sources that also move, maybe real-time lighting?
Light sources that move, anything that moves, including light sources, need to be real-time. Because otherwise it gets weirdly cursed. The engine gets really upset about its building properties and whatnot. If, like, for example, your character is carrying a flashlight, or there's a searchlight, or any light that moves, it needs to be real-time per se. For example, good question. Because our directional light is set to stationary, and stationary introduces the properties of, you can see right there, it can't move, but it does allow dynamic lighting. And look at the last sentence. It can change in color and intensity in a game. Meaning that even though it can't move, we can do stuff like this, or we can change its color and it's not going to be mad because it's going to immediately try to update the lighting however we see fit. If we did that to the static light would be like, whoa, what are you doing? You need to do a rebake because we changed the lighting color. In fact, if I change the color in here, or if I change the intensity in here, this is a static light, we're going to get a warning already because static lights cannot be manipulated without needing to rebake. Just use stationary lights if you're going to be using Look, if you're running out of performance using stationary lights, you got bigger problems. You're using 8K textures on everything. The only time you're really trying to tamp down on what your performance is supposed to look like is if you are on a machine with super tight specs. Like if you're making stuff for an iOS device, or making stuff for an Android device, and the specs are unbelievably tight. Like, okay, yeah, some of your lights should be static, stationary lights only for the best looking shadows, so on and so forth. Very few, if any, real-time shadows. Very few if you can get away with them. Maybe on your character, so on and so forth. But if you're making a game for a PC and you're running into performance issues because you use stationary lights, it's not your lights.
Yeah.
It's something else. You have made a mistake somewhere else. You have too much geometry somewhere. There are other ways that you can affect that, right? That's going to be more important later on, but we'll talk about that in the future. If I switch this to a stationary light and do a rebuild, oh, I don't even have to rebuild. It's just like, oh, hey, okay, cool. I don't have to do a rebuild. If I'm back to static, it's going to want to rebuild. All right. What is movable light then? I'm going to change all my lights in the scene to movable. That just means that the lights are real time, which means the shadows are real time. Is that no different from Lumen? Well, we don't get GI. Question?
How do different shadows react to each other? Like a static shadow versus do they overlap or?
If you're asking like if it gets weird if we move a shadow here, in fact, let me go ahead and change that back to stationary. Let me do a quick rebake, and we'll move our character. And in fact, we'll throw a skylight in there just so we can see the maximum effect. Come on. Why are you fighting me? Throw a skylight in here. Whoop. Yay. And we'll pump up the power of the skylight. There we go. We have our character here. We're going to move our character back here. That's because we get this. Let me see if I can find this. Is this one? There we go. Because what's happening in the scene is the engine is making assessments on what the light is supposed to do at different places. This is basically your volumetric light map. This is not really super important to know, but it's nice that we can see it. It's basically what's happening as far as the influence on lighting is happening depending on the side of the object. It's basically saying, no, you don't get like a super shadow. The engine just modulates the shadow where there's no lighting. Even though right now our light is set to stationary, which means that this shadow back here is a cascaded shadow map, which means it's not real time, but the character's shadow is considered real time because it's able to move, and you can see kind of like a quality distinction if we move out. The rules say that if the two shadows interact, the engine figures it out for you. It's actually quite nice. It's part of what makes Unreal Unreal. It just makes, not that it makes the lighting any easier, because none of this conversation is easy. But it just, I hate using the term it just works, because it almost never does. But it does handle a lot of the shadows for you, and it makes a lot of those decisions for you without having to worry about whether or not you have a super shadow or an underexposed shadow, so on and so forth. If your main lights are set and your mobility settings are set properly, your shadows should work. You will almost never run into a situation where it might get strange. It happens, and then at that point, you have to change something, but it should generally work. Shadows will interact to their maximum capacity. All right, let me talk about movable lights. I already set this to movable. And in fact, let me bring this out here. Does everybody see how this light now has a little four-way directional pad right there? That's telling you that the light is in fact movable. Which means that the light is casting, not that the light can move, but that the light is now considered real time. Does that mean that light mass is now lumen? No. The difference between lumen and light mass falls into the same rule set that we talked about earlier. In fact, let me go ahead and re-demonstrate this just so we can see the big difference. And in fact, just so that I change mobility settings, let me go ahead and do a quick rebuild of all the lighting to get rid of as much of the light map information as possible, because everything is now real time. Where's my fancy green glow? What's all this splotchiness? Let me go ahead and select the post-process volume. We'll hide in here for a sec. Let me go ahead and show modified properties. And my GI method, I'll change it to lumen. That is the biggest difference between light mass and lumen. Lumen is considered a ray tracing analog. If not directly considered ray tracing, light mass does not do ray tracing. Light mass is a baked solution for high performance in games. Right now lumen is on because I've enabled it, because this is why the post-process volume is nice. I can just do that in the game. Look, oh yeah, lumen looks amazing. Ooh, it's great. Awesome. Let me disable. So you can see that generally speaking, lumen is going to give you GI and those nice kind of fall off effects at a cost, right? It costs more. Well, Mr. Figueroa, what if I want this object to be glowing green as well, or if I want the room to be glowing green as well? Let me tell you about a point light. You just throw a light in there. And then I would probably, since I'm not doing anything with it, I would set that point light to what? Static. And then I wouldn't think about it ever again. Questions?
Wait, like, when you put a light into an object, do you have to like modify the object or?
No. If there's light penetration into an object, the object will turn itself off to the light. You can't put an object, you can't put a light inside of a static mesh, and the static mesh occludes it, unless the mesh itself has a shell. If you make a shell, yes. But if a light goes inside of an object, the object is considered not shadowing.
Yeah.
That's just kind of what Unreal does, because a lot of what happens in game design is that we just throw lights on top of the thing to make it emit light. It's easier if the light doesn't.
But if the static mesh encompasses the light, does it contain the light, such as the realm?
Yeah,
Okay.
because that has a shell. Unreal gets really weird once you start getting. Okay, this is more like technical, but I try to tell people if they're designing worlds not to have pixel thin walls. Epic gets real weird about pixel thin interactions. So everybody saw when the light was bleeding under that ground? What do you think that interaction is between the floor and the ground? It's about a pixel. Really doesn't like that. Unreal does not want to do those interactions if at all possible. It wants what's called manifold geometry in order to prevent that. Mr. Figueroa, I can't build the house into the ground. I know. We solve that by increasing the light samples in light mass. And in order to do that, we do that in the light mass settings, which I'll demonstrate probably next week at this point, because I'm running out of time. We've had a longer conversation about lighting than I've expected. So why light mass? It just performs better. It's going to be better in almost every case. You can get the exact same look. Question?
This is short, but like, would lighting come towards the end of development as in game production?
Typically speaking, it's considered part of your layout. So if I'm blocking in something, I block in the lighting as well. Different places will want to do different things. If the level design calls for a very specific type of lighting, then that is going to be prototyped in with a quick layout. It's not something that's saved towards the end, so on and so forth. Because saving it to the end, we don't need creative decisions at the end. We just need to build the thing. So with all that in mind, with all this baking, etc., what's the right solution here? What if I told you that the correct solution is not to set your mobility settings at all, is to do this. In fact, I'm going to eliminate all of our lights, and I'm going to show how I set up my scene for light mass. Sorry, Skysphere. Yep, we can still see the sky because the sky itself is self-illuminated, so that's kind of how it works. All right, I'm gonna. Where's my tool here? Oh no, there it is. I'm blind. I'm going to create a skylight. I know it's mad. Create atmospheric light. It's going to create a directional light. Cool. That's great. I'm not going to worry about that stuff right away. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure. Oh. Set that to movable. Set that to movable. Disable real time. Put in my lights. Notice how it stopped casting weird light. Hide my light. Grab my eyedropper. Get the color that I want. From my point light. Make sure my point light is movable. That's fine. I mean, that looks like GI to me. It's not, but you get the idea. Basically, the right setup for doing any light mask stuff is you ignore all the light mask stuff. Set everything to movable, and then light your scene according to what you need to do in your scene in general. So why all the mobility stuff? Because before you finish, at that point you go back and make your optimizations. So for example, well, my point light here, static, my skylight, stationary, my directional light, stationary, another light that I might have over here for vibes, that can just be static. Maybe there's a light over here that's going to specifically cast a shadow on a character. Let me go ahead and do a spotlight. So when the character moves in a very specific place. I don't know how many candles. I'm just going to throw a bunch of zeros in there. Good enough. This light should probably, since I need a real-time shadow for a character. There we go. That one should probably be stationary instead of movable. Okay, cool. We'll do our build. And that's how your optimizations happen. Your lighting should be assembled fully real time, just because that way you don't have to think about it. But then when you're done, you go back and then you set your optimizations where you need them to be, right? So, for example, I have a combination of 3 stationary lights, a static light over here that's being just used to add light over here, another static light that's in here that's being used to just add light to the scene, and no movable lights. Well, the only movable shadow that's going to be cast is if the character is 1 in the directional light, because of course movable shadow. The spotlight obviously also directional. Or the spotlight is also casting a real-time light, so it's going to cast another shadow. And that's about it. Everything else can be set up to static or otherwise, depending on what you need. Realistically, can I set all these to stationary? Yeah, it's not gonna make a difference, so on and so forth. The last thing that I want to cover before we get away from talking about the static, stationary, etc. discussion is ultimately the way that you light your scene is going to be up to you in terms of your overall performance. I'm going to go ahead and show my FPS here. And I'm going to go ahead, let's see, I'm getting a solid maybe, if I'm moving around maybe 30, that's about 90. If I enable Lumen, just by default, you see that it eats about 30 FPS immediately on this kind of weaker machine, right? On a stronger machine, it's not going to be a difference. But that does make a difference, depending on your source machine, depending on the quality of your texture. We're using basic objects here, a slightly more advanced object and very basic lighting. It's going to make a difference when your scene gets really complicated and you are casting a bunch of shadows. Lumen is going to be a little bit strange in a lot of cases, just in general. But it is the default lighting solution because it is easy to set and you don't have to worry about mobility. Take your pick, right? It's really not necessarily a good or bad thing to pick one over the other, but you have to know how both work, because most games are shipped with baked lighting because we get that performance back. But Lumen exists so that you can go ahead and light your environments as quickly as possible, and as long as you have anything higher than a 2060, the engine doesn't really care. Most games are using some form of ray tracing in general anyways. You play Forza, you play any kind of high resolution racing game, you play any kind of COD game, they're using some form of ray tracing or real-time lighting. That's okay. Realistically, it's about the cost performance versus the overall look. I'll go ahead and demonstrate some of that next week. I'm punting the assignment from this week to next week so I can cover the material stuff as well, because I don't want to just kind of be like, all right, go ahead and light a scene. We'll go ahead and move that to next week. So I'm not going to make any assignment for this week, but the assignment is going to be bigger next week, if that makes any sense. Right, folks? My advice is play around with some of the lighting for next week. So you get an opportunity to one, test out the tools. The tools are the easiest part. You only have 4 or 5 lights to work with. It's fine. The hard part is knowing how to manipulate the settings to get the lighting that you want to do, or that you want to get, and then pick a sort of lighting solution that you want. I'm not gonna be mad if people pick Lumen because Lumen works. Question?
So there won't be an assignment due next Monday?
I am not having any I'm not assigning anything this week, so I'm going to change the due date of that. There is no assignment due next week. Question?
What was the assignment going to be?
The assignment this week was going to be. Let me go ahead and. You know, instead of logging it in, the assignment this week was supposed. You can actually look at it on Canvas here, but not Canvas. Moodle. This week's assignment should be materials and lighting, which says take your environment from assignment 1 or the alternate assignment that I'm going to be giving you guys. That's not set up yet, so we need to set that up. Find an online pack guide variety or textures to use for your assignment 2. You may author your own, or you may take inspiration for texture setups, other environments. Your goal should be to apply textures to your scene to give your environment more personality, and lighting to finish the overall vibe. I went ahead and made some of my own scenes to demonstrate the process, both interior and exterior. I'll get to you in a sec. If you prefer, you may take the sample scene from Infinity Blade Grasslands and the case study base map that we haven't built yet, and modify it and light it to taste. Make sure that you build out more of the environment using assets available and your own textures to the assignment to make it your own, or create derivative work away from what the default was. Your goal here is to build learning and understanding for your previous assignment, and learn to implement lighting and texture to your scene. We'll be moving on from this series of assignments after assignment 2, so don't worry about keeping this map up to date and polished. We'll revisit world building, especially since it seems like a lot of people are building outdoor environments, in depth by around the time we get to week 6, I believe. So, you got any more questions?
So we can use the environment we used for the first assignment?
Yes, you can.
Would we use any Quixel assets or materials? Do we need to change those, or?
No, you don't. I still will cover how to make your own materials with Quixel assets, because you get the textures anyways.
Yeah.
But I'll cover how to make your own custom textures and whatnot, because believe it or not, Quixel doesn't give you any landscape materials. You have to kind of build your own, which is easy, but also not super easy if you don't know how to use materials in general. Question?
Are we building off of our week 1 project?
For our next assignment, you may. I encourage it, but for those of you who are like, man, I just don't want to deal with this assignment anymore, I will also build a secondary submission so that people do not have to be married to their first assignment. It's given as an option, but you are not obligated. All right, I'm not going to assign. Go ahead. Good.
I'd switch to like the big lighting, and like specifically some areas like under foliage, like the canopy under foliage gets really dark.
Mm-hmm.
And if I didn't like that, would you recommend any playing around with anything?
What's your skylight doing?
Directional or
Skylight.
skylight?
Do you have a skylight in the scene?
Yeah. Sorry, switching to the base lighting with the
Uh-huh.
static.
Right.
Yeah.
Increase the power of your skylight little by little. Usually increase it by about 15% until you get a final look. Although, set all your lighting to movable, get your lighting right, and then make a decision on what your final performance saving should be.
Okay.
You're probably going to be all stationary anyways.
Okay.
And then the final look should change very little, if that makes any sense. More light. If it's dark, more light.
Okay.
If it's too dark, more light.
Okay.
So no assignment this week, folks. I'm not quite done with the lecture. I need more time to cover all of the stuff that I need. Another question? My advice, play around with the lighting in your scene that you have. Try to keep some of the tools fresh, because I'm going to continue to lecture based on the stuff that I covered this week. Play around with it as you see fit. Like I said, in a perfect world, everybody would be hands on a machine and be doing the same stuff that I'm doing. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this video is uploaded before I get out of here. Do I have any other questions for next week? I'm not making an assignment until we get everything finished that I'd like to finish. Alright, texturing stuff next week. We'll be covering things like blendables. We'll be covering things like light functions. We'll be covering things like translucent so on materials. Question?
What about like material brushes?
like material brushes,
Or material blending.
like
You mean
like
have
Vertex paint?
Vertex paint.
Yeah, I'll cover some of that. It's, I mean, Vertex paint is really just kind of like, I don't want to say a given, but you use it to kind of make derivative work. I mean, sorry, I know we're at time here, folks, but I'm just showing. Come on, faster. Clear. Go away. I always forget to fix this. It's called mesh paint in here. Select that. Paint. Woo! There we go. And all that's because this material here is set up to have multiple layers. We can talk about that as well. Usually I use 3 layers myself. Just kind of. What he's talking about is like if you have the same wall over and over, a little bit of mesh paint can make the same wall look better, and it's just for modular design.
And like when you wanna like apply moss or
Exactly, that's what I typically do. Usually I apply moss to rocks, and I'll use a. How badly do you want me to mess up your life? Because we can use height blends, or I can use just a simple vertex blend. Height blends are a little more advanced, in the sense that it detects the distance between 2 objects and then allows you to kind of create a blend based on a height based blend. But it depends on what you kind of want. We'll try it. Question.
We're going into week 6 or 7. Will you also cover gameplay mechanics?
Yes, next week should have been blueprint stuff, but it's gonna take a little bit longer to cover this stuff. Yeah, we'll cover some gameplay stuff in terms of like blueprints. What do you mean by gameplay mechanics though?
Like vaulting, sliding, or like movement.
Like just like movement, that's just blueprint stuff. So, I mean, we can cover some of that stuff. There's a litany of things that we can cover, but they're really it's just blueprints and animations. So, if you're looking for like more like theory, that's Joe Shupak's class. He talks a lot more about theory. I talk more about application of theory. So,
What class is
that's I think. Oh my gosh, he's the intro to games design. I think. He talks a lot about the theory of game design, where it's like I talk more about the here's how to make the thing do the thing. I guess.
That's a good class.
Yeah, his class is really good in relation to theory. I wish I got a chance to talk more theory, but we only got 2 hours and 50 minutes to cover as much as I possibly can. I wish I got you guys twice a week, but it doesn't work that way.
I know a lot of us took that class last quarter.
Mhm. All right, folks, we're at time here. No assignment this week. I'm gonna change the due date on that. Make sure you got everything else in. But otherwise, take care of yourselves and each other. If you drive safe. I'll see everyone next week. Practice this stuff, please. It'll just make you a little bit more confident in it.
When do you grade stuff?
I'm sorry?
When are you grading the last lesson?
I haven't gotten around to do that. I need to do that.
Oh yeah.
So you said it'd be pretty quick to show me kind of, basically, do I need to screen record to play?
Well, let's see what's on here. Oh, this is what I use myself.
Okay.
Please don't tell me I have to log in. I don't want to log in. I just double clicked that. Wait, no! Come on, please, GeForce Experience.
Lecture. And you're like, you know what, I wanna put this one here. She's like, actually, no. You probably save yourself more time just going to the
No.
But I asked at
But
some point you can
at the same time
add
though, if there's
administrator
anything
access to a couple of
smaller
things.
detail that you
Sure, I
can
definitely can.
fix it if you're not there.
Thank you.
Video. And then he also does that thing where he just like will. And then our
Well,
the
here,
actual
let me
class
stop
session
this.
itself is like